Hello everyone, and welcome to another amazing story. What if Deku was a necromancer? Magnus9284 wrote this amazing story. Please support them. Don't forget to like, sub, and leave a comment. Now let's dive in. Chapter 32. A Sinister Limit. While the rest of the world was seemingly attempting to restart its collective brain after witnessing the rather pointed speech so eloquently given by one Tsuyu Azui, as well as her sudden acceptance of a marriage proposal of all things, Mashireo Ojiro had long since sequestered himself away as he spoke over the phone with a particular individual that meant the world to him. A sensei? Ojiro forced himself to murmur into his phone, the plain teen already struggling to keep his tears at bay. I'm sorry. I couldn't win. Even after you put so much effort into my training? Ojiro, whose only claim to any sort of recognizability in a group such as Class 1A was his skills as a martial artist, was hurting fiercely. The pain struck deeper than merely losing during the sports festival's tournament, though because in all honesty he'd known his chances of winning were near zero with powerhouses like Todoroki in the running. In truth, it was the fact that he'd been reminded of how powerless, how outmatched people like him were against those with better quirks. It was unfair, totally and completely. Worse, it was just like that damnable day. The day his sensei had lost to that bastard. Mashikun, stop that, chided a clearly feminine voice, whose authoritative tone was only marred slightly by how young its owner could be heard to be. Even out on patrol, I was able to take a moment and watch your fight. It was a bad matchup. You were given a bad opponent to face with no prior knowledge. The calm reassurance only caused more tears to well up in the tailed teen's eyes, a thick knot growing in his throat that he couldn't speak around. Unwilling to audibly sob while speaking to the person who had arguably become the most important person in his life, Ojiro swallowed hard and squeezed his eyes shut. Lady Wukong, one of the numerous heroines that time had forgotten. Unlike many of her predecessors and contemporaries, however, when her hero career had hit a wall, she'd been unwilling to fade away so easily, and had taken the good fight from the streets to the teaching stage. There, she'd had much better luck imparting her wisdom and teachings to eager students, individuals of all ages that required a guiding hand, and special training, to survive in a world dominated by the natural-born might of those blessed by flashy and powerful quirks. As if to set an example even in that for her students, nowadays it was only those who attended her dojo regularly that knew Lady Wukong had even been a pro-heroine for any length of time previously. Tsuruko Toyotomi had never reached a level of fame worth mentioning during her short 5 years on the circuit, a mediocre career hamstrung from the start by being born with an unremarkable mutant quirk plainly labeled monkey on day one. For all of her martial skill, keen intellect, and leadership ability, not to mention a special kind of wild beauty, a pair of slightly larger than normal hands, a monkey's tail, and opposable thumbs on her feet did not a blockbuster heroine make. I know. Ojiro heaved, breathing deeply as he saw the world begin to blur through his tears. I just wanted to. I know. Lady Wu, as Ojiro had long since begun to call her during private conversations, soothed, softening her voice, any edge that had been there falling away. You don't think I didn't want my favorite little Cedo to win, do you? It was a sad parallel, the unfairness of Lady Wukong's pro-career and quirk and what felt like Ojiro's whole life. But that was one of the things that the tailed teen loved about the simian-esque woman. To him, she had always stood as the embodiment of what it meant to continue on, determined and unbroken, in a world that refused to acknowledge the unextraordinary. Lady Wu sighed, and Ojiro pulled himself from his thoughts to refocus on the woman who'd been his rock for so long. But life is unfair, the simian-esque woman continued, voice softening even further. That's why we train so hard every day. So we have the ability to face that unfairness with strength and determination. Why, yes, sensei? Ojiro automatically replied, hands and tail beginning to shake as he attempted to hold in his roiling emotions. He could be strong for her. Please, I'm in your care. Keep training me. It would be fair to say Ojiro loved his sensei dearly, perhaps far more than he should for one his age. However, also to be fair, Lady Wukong was a pro-heroine, however small time, still in her prime, not even 10 years his senior. She taught him everything he knew, and yet the tailed teen knew his sensei's knowledge of martial arts went mostly untapped day to day. And that didn't even begin to cover her sharp wit, bright disposition, nor her dedication to supporting her students, in protecting them. Truly, the simian-esque woman was a beauty in more ways than one. You know, Mashikun, once I finish this business I have to attend to, I think I'll stay in Hosu a little longer before I return to the dojo. Lady Wu announced, voice lowering. Ojiro felt his face flush. Now he felt pressure in his head and guts for an entirely different reason. If I send Yue an official internship application, we could spend a week there and discuss your new training regime. Maybe go and get ramen after we're all tired out. Just as unspoken as Ojiro's deep love for his sensei, so too was the simian-esque woman's own indiscretion, her own feelings for her favored student. Even unconfirmed as the emotions were, kept locked away by Lady Wukong's iron will, moments such as this where hints bubbled to the surface were a source of conflict for the tailed teen. On one hand, Ojiro desperately wished, hoped even, that his illicit ardor was returned by the woman who'd taken his heart. On the other, he saw himself as completely unworthy if they were. At the moment he was too weak in body and in mind. That belief was one of the major factors that propelled the plain hero in training's actions, drove him to train tirelessly to become stronger. Ojiro still gave thanks even now that Yue had conveniently given him the perfect milestones to pit himself against as he progressed. If he could learn how to defeat dark quirk users like Midoriya and that Shinso guy, he'd be that much closer to achieving his ultimate goal. One day he'd finally defeat that goddamn bastard that shamed his Lady Wu, and he'd make everything right again. Yes, sensei. Ojiro replied, just managing to keep the quiver from his voice as he pushed aside his turbulent thoughts. The hot, wet trails running down his cheeks, however, couldn't be stopped. I'll be there. You can count on me. Still tearing up, Ojiro somehow felt energized despite his current disposition. Sure, Class 1A might have somehow already found itself with two official couples that flaunted their kitty love openly and distractingly, but the tailed teen knew better. His true love was waiting for him. And one day he'd be mature enough, strong enough, a real man amongst men, and they'd face the world together. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena. The semi-finals were about to begin, and the crowd in attendance filling the stands was as riled up as possible. Around the world, every man, woman, and child willing and able had their faces glued to whichever screen they could find that could televise the broadcasted festival. No one in their right mind wanted to miss the next match. The monster of UA was taking the stage once again, and this time he was facing the now so-called Iron Brawler that had defeated one of the scions of the prestigious Ida family. At this point in the festival, two specific types of bets were being made on the match. One, of course, was focused on predicting the winner of the fight. The other, well, that was more focused on the macabre idea of guessing what horror would be unleashed upon the world next. So far the public had witnessed a frightfully mindless undead so terrible its single opposition had only survived by a miracle, and a reanimated gaijin that had obviously been the result of the sinister Verdunette absconding with a random body after two street gangs had clashed. So, what would the monster bring to the table next? Are you ready for the semi-finals, folks? The best of the best are ready to rumble, so you better be ready for some crazy battling. Yeah. Present Mike easily riled up the spectators even farther, his quirk-amplified voice so loud it rumbled through the air like thunder, really obnoxious thunder. Regardless, cheers and applause rose up to meet his cry, rattling the stadium to its foundations. Those watching from television and monitors at home or elsewhere were quick to lower the projected volume before the overexuberance threatened to shatter their speaker systems. The old saying, "the whole world is watching," was incredibly apt at that moment. From the southwest gate, after remaining unbending and unbroken through the sort of opposition that even pros would find daunting, it's the man of steel from our heroics course 1B himself. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Tetsu. The manliest man of Class 1B stepped into the arena resolutely, face set in a grim countenance. To say Tetsu wasn't looking forward to this fight was a severe understatement, although it was for more reasons than just apprehension at facing off against Midoriya. Part of the steely teen saw the matchup as unfair, since even though his current opponent had quite the dangerous quirk, he was still just flesh and bone. Previously, that Ida guy and the pink girl afterward were clearly sturdier than the average person, but Midoriya hadn't shown any such constitution. That led to the other part of Tetsu's problem with the match. No matter his new oath regarding how he'd approach combat, he'd still have to go easy on the 1A student if he didn't want to kill him. Despite Midoriya's regenerative powers, just how much could the Verdunette's body take against the steel he could bring to bear? With a sigh, the manly man of Class 1B concluded that he'd have to grapple the Verdunette into submission, or throw him out of bounds as quickly as he could, if he didn't want this match to get unpleasantly nasty. Thankfully, he'd be able to ignore whichever of Midoriya's undead he decided to bring, none of them possibly strong enough to overcome his quirk. And from the northeast gate, he's kept surprising us in the most sinister ways possible. It's the Mons, necromancer of heroics course 1A Izuku Midoriya. Even up and away as they were, many in the stadium's audience could have sworn at that moment that they felt an unholy glare radiating from the location of the two pro heroes announcing the sports festival. And accompanying him this time is he supposed to be a lone eraser? And he was. Stepping out into the arena, the young necromancer took the stage, utterly alone. There was no undead abomination following him this time, no mockery of a living person set to heed his words in battle. Civilians, by and large, gave a sigh of relief at the sight, assuming UA had finally decided to crack down on their monstrous student's dark potential. Conversely, most of the pros watching reached the conclusion that the boy's quirk had finally reached its limit and the Verdinet had thought better of pushing himself when it came to controlling such dangerous creatures. There might have been a misunderstanding here. Midoriya was only limited to one partner per match, he should still have. Hearing an underground hero like Eraserhead trail off mid-sentence caused a lot of heads to turn, present and abroad. UA Sports Festival Stadium, commentator press box. Aizawa glared down at the now crumbled papers he held in his hands. Those crafty bastards. There was nothing worse than bureaucrats except bureaucrats that were legitimately intelligent to a point. The board had really put their heads together this time regarding Midoriya's handicap. Cutting through all the pretty legalese, the grizzled man understood the real purpose of the conditions presented. On the surface, Midoriya had been told he would only be allowed to bring one partner to a match. In and of itself that was reasonable and logical. After all, Tei and Saki both on the scene at once would have been overkill. Then came the condition that the Verdinet would have to switch out partners each fight if he utilized their aid. Not the most damning constraint by itself, more an annoyance really. But as the foreign proverb went, the devil's in the details. The exact words for each condition were far too loose to be a coincidence. The phrase allowed the single use of an attached quirk-driven being for the duration of the event in question. Was one such instance of ambivalence that one could take to mean various different things. It could have merely meant Midoriya could only use one partner per match. It could also have meant that Izuku was only allowed to use one of his partners a single time for the entirety of the third event. Since he'd walked out alone for this match, it was doubtless that Midoriya had figured out the trick. With only 3 partners, if he made it all the way to the final match, the situation could go one of 3 ways, and one of those was just wishful thinking. In the first possibility, the Verdinet wouldn't be allowed a partner after bringing Tei, Saki, and Lily along to one match each. The result was doubtlessly for him to stand against Todoroki, the inevitable matchup, alone in the finals. In the second possibility was subtler. If no one had caught the vagueness of the contract until Midoriya had already brought a partner to the final match, and he then won, the board could use it to disqualify him on charges of breaking rules he himself had accepted to participate under. The third possibility was that he was a paranoid man always jumping at shadows and the board had just wanted to keep Midoriya from steamrolling the competition. But Aizawa had lived through too much, seen too much, done too much not to believe wholeheartedly that those shadows weren't just waiting for the opportunity to jump first. A stray thought crossed the underground pro's mind, wondering if Nizu knew of this latest ploy. If so, how was the principal going to respond? UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena. Ahem. Whatever his reasoning for this odd choice, it's the remit of our referee Midnight to clarify Midoriya's options. Aizawa knew how to be crafty too. Even without his student's quirk accelerating his thinking, he was no slouch when it came to maneuvering a situation to the benefit of whomever he saw fit. From her place on the field, Midnight was quick to catch on to what her coworker had done. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. The Ravenet jumped in, eager to throw her weight around now that her position in the festival actually allowed it. Midoriya may have been told he'd be forced to limit the participa. It's all right. I'll fight by myself. The interruption was spoken so softly that Midnight barely heard it. Turning to the Verdinet who'd spoken, the R-rated heroine saw not the face of a teen frustrated at his unfair treatment, but the resolute visage of a young man that said there was nothing to worry about now that he was there. The board doesn't want me here, so they set me up to lose again, Izuku continued, keeping his voice low so no one else overheard him. But if that was their goal, then they should have tried harder. At that moment, Midnight realized something strange. Midoriya had said he'd fight by himself, not alone. It was a certain distinction to make, but what it could possibly mean was lost on the normally overly sensual woman. Not immediately understanding the random thought she'd had, the 18-plus only heroine quickly fell back into stewing on how one of her students was being so mistreated. But, are you sure about that? The sudden shout from a scowling Tetsu snapped both Izuku and Midnight's focus to the steely teen. Apparently the 1B student's hearing was a lot better than the Verdunette had expected. I want to win, sure, but I don't want to take down someone fighting with a handicap. Tetsu shouted further, arms just barely kept from flying through the air in disbelief and frustration. Seriously, call one of your partners if you need to. Heck, call two. Much to Izuku's pleasant surprise, there wasn't a hint of mockery in the steely teen's words. The Kirishima lookalike was apparently truly concerned about his opponent. No need, Izuku replied, smiling a grin that absolutely did not belong on the face of someone who could raise and control the undead. A hero must be able to adapt and overcome life's various struggles as they come, to win despite any restrictions placed on them, natural or otherwise. This is just another such instance I have been made to face. Tetsu felt an odd cross between respect for his opponent's manliness and shame for doubting he had such. Shaking off the pointless feelings, the steely teen regained his ironclad determination and nodded stiffly in acceptance. To the side, Midnight sighed at the sight. This was going to be a painful match to watch one way or another, but both competitors had agreed to it. The Verdunette, she guessed, probably did so to prove some sort of point about not being a monster due to his quirk. The other's personality and pride at being a man wouldn't let him run away from any fight. Very well. Midnight announced, raising her flag. Competitor Midoriya has chosen to comply with the board's additional restrictions, and will not be fully utilizing his abilities this match. The declaration immediately earned quite a lot of heat from all sides. Surprisingly, civilians and pros alike were angrily whispering to each other and those around them about the revelation. The fact that UA's board had personally involved themselves to the point of handicapping a student, regardless of the nature of their quirk, struck a nerve in many. The general consensus of these hypocrites was that dark quirks needed controlling, yes, but blatant obstruction during an event as sacred as the sports festival was somehow going too far. For themselves, the various members of the board were both enraged at being obliquely called out, and nervously squirming in their cushioned seats under the ferocious glare directed at them from UA's rightfully furious principal. "All right, gentlemen," Midnight called out, redirecting the rising discontent to the fact the match was about to begin. The grumbling and grousing from the stands quieted, and the Ravenette continued after glancing at the still calmly standing Verdunette. "Remember the rules and give us a fair but exciting fight. Begin." Once again, Tetsu wasted not a single second the moment the battle began. The steely teen activated his quirk immediately, knowing that as long as his body was in its metallic form his opponent's blood shouldn't be able to get inside of him. With that, he charged forward, no worries about the Verdian having superhuman physical attributes present to slow him down. Even if Midoriya somehow managed to repeat that super-fast punch from his last match, what use was a fleshy fist against his steel? Staring down the living steel hurtling toward him, Izuku calmly took a ready position. Taking a deep breath, he then prodded what he decided to call his inner mind with his consciousness, fumbling about for a live connection with his quirk. The Verdunette had decided that he'd use this match as the grounds for an experiment. Could cursed blood be commanded to reinforce his entire body in a more constant manner than before? Suchan had been understandably worried before they'd parted, but in the end she'd settled for merely telling him she believed in him and that he was in control of his quirk, not the other way around. "I hope this works," Izuku muttered under his breath, already feeling his veins tingling as his subconscious desire was picked up by his quirk before he could even say a word. Cursed blood. Full rush. Time slowed, sound faded, and the world contracted around Izuku to only include himself and his opponent. Across from the Verdunette, the steel teen that had managed to get only steps away so quickly, and had readied a haymaker as well, had become so decelerated the sight was somewhat humorous. Momentarily frozen in shock that his first attempt had succeeded on the very first try, Izuku quickly regained control of himself and tried to move out of the way of the incoming attack. Instantly, the Verdunette found his body up against some kind of opposition, as if he were trying to move underwater. Even so, he was still able to move out of the way of the wild punch in time before it was even launched. As the decelerated Tetsu finally closed the distance, Izuku moved with and behind him, watching as the steely teen's eyes slowly widened as he realized his target had disappeared from in front of him. Readying a hand, the verdant hero in training lashed out and slapped down onto one of the 1B student's ears. K-slap. To the rest of the world, Midoriya became a blur. One moment he appeared unable or unwilling to move, the next he was behind his charging opponent before the steely teen could even finish his first punch. The Verdunette's own strike was also of note to those in the rows closest to the action, as they could actually hear the power behind it from their places in the stands. Tetsu stumbled, skidding to the side with a seemingly drunken sway before catching himself. A hand of steel flew up to cup the abused ear while rapidly blinking steel eyes appeared disoriented. Eraserhead, what did your student just do? How did he do that? Midoriya's profile doesn't cover any abilities even close to super strength or super speed. And what's up with his eyes? Since when were they red? Present Mike wasn't the only one with such questions. The entire stadium buzzed with similar. Even those among Class 1A were stumped at what they'd just seen. Who knew Midoriya was capable of such feats? Surrounded by Tei, Saki, and Lily, only Tsuyu gave an affirmative nod, never having doubted her boyfriend's abilities. I don't know, but if I had to take a guess, I'd have to say it appears as if Midoriya has somehow used his quirk to turn off his body's mental limiters, allowing it to be used to its fullest potential. Such a hypothesis was unsettling to many, to say the least. Men and women with physical enhancement quirks refused to believe the underground pro, because if he were right that meant their individuality was within reach of normal people, and they themselves weren't actually that special at all. Those with more biased opinions, however, were more incensed that a mutant type was once again performing feats outside of its designation. Thankfully, anyone with even a hint of genuine medical knowledge kept their heads about them, mostly due to their educations allowing them to understand the Verdunet's new skill just wasn't within reach of the everyday person. Nor was it wise to access such a skill for long at all. As Tetsu staggered, taking a couple of steps before righting himself, Izuku took the time to gather himself as well. Damn it, that had hurt. The Verdunet's hand and arm, not to mention his legs, were screaming at him, their nerves on fire. His success had come at a cost, it seemed, which meant that his time was severely limited. Grah! Time was up. With a defiant roar, the manly man of Class 1B charged forward again. When Tetsu had stepped back, his unintentional action had managed to remind him of the class-wide test 1B had taken, and how he'd failed after having his shortcomings driven home. Now he'd learned his lesson, and he refused to allow any opponent the chance to think, to develop a strategy against him anymore. Sela had studied him while he'd attacked brainlessly like an idiot, and the faceless pro had taken him apart because of it. Unfortunately for the steely teen, this new red-eyed Midoriya hadn't stuck to his habitual boxer style. Oh well, that just meant that he'd have to adapt as well. Ugh. Izuku had stepped into the latest charge, unexpectedly ramming into the metallic abdomen of his opponent. If Tetsu's steps back had been a reminder of his lesson, then being flung over Midoriya's shoulder after having his own strength used against him was a conjuration of the entire nightmarish experience. It wasn't exactly like Sela's moves from back then, however. The Verdunet had technique, but thankfully lacked the flowing expertise the masked pro had exhibited. Crashing to the ground still hurt though. Gaha! Tetsu choked out, the cry more a result of the teen's pride being reminded of his weakness than actual physical pain. But he trained for situations like this. Quickly, Tetsu drew one arm under himself and pushed upward, spinning as he did so to deliver a powerful strike to the ground. Boom! A cloud of debris and dust shot into the air, temporarily hiding both students from sight. Using that moment to the fullest, Tetsu stood up and got into a defensive stance. Whatever Midoriya had done to enhance himself, the steely teen wasn't sure how long his opponent could keep it up, but even so he wasn't afraid. Everything he knew about the other teen's quirk said it shouldn't have been able to make him stronger at all, just regenerate from damage and control corpses, so while unexpected the new ability couldn't last long enough to be a concern. No, what Tetsu feared was Midoriya's mind. According to Minoma, the Verdunet of Class 1A was akin to Master Strategist, the kind of opponent that was almost his exact opposite. And contrary to popular belief, Steel wasn't the perfect defense. If he was dragged into a drawn-out fight due to his opponent's machinations, the manly teen knew his quirk would start to wane as his iron stores began to deplete into the red. The sound of footfalls coming from his right pulled the steely teen of Class 1B from his thoughts. There you are. Tetsu roared, swinging a fist back while aiming at where he guesstimated Midoriya's head would be in the dust cloud. He'd take him out quickly before he could think of any brainy plans. Boosted or not, no one could survive unscathed from what amounted to a cannonball to the face. Izuku moved, barely avoiding the hair-trigger reaction aiming to knock him out, and then, much to the surprise of his metal-covered opponent, took a full-force swing of his own. The counter was so unexpected that Tetsu didn't even think to move. Flesh against steel could only have one result after all. Blinded by the slowly clearing dust, however, it had been impossible for Tetsu to notice that Izuku wasn't, in fact, attempting to hit him with his bare fist. Boom-a-crack. Out of the dust flew Tetsu, rolling as his metal body hit the ground hard. When the steely teen didn't immediately stand back up, a drone zoomed in on him, its camera eye whirring. Those watching through the floating machine saw the stunning sight of a long and wicked-looking dent running from right above the insensate student's left ear to his chin. Meanwhile, the world continued to spin for Tetsu, who'd actually felt that last strike. The explosion of pain in his skull had rattled him worse than being bodily thrown around like a little tin soldier, and nausea from a serious head wound was already setting in. Shooting a hand to the flaring agony across the left side of his head, the steely teen looked up, blearily able to see his opponent through the settling dust. Eyes still a brilliant ruby, Midoriya stepped forward, a nearly pulverized bit of concrete in one hand, and a whole piece in the other. "What's with that look?" Izuku asked, barely getting through the fog that had descended on the metal boy after his last attack. "You really didn't think that someone wouldn't figure it out eventually? That not all of you become metal when you use your quirk?" Frigid ice shot down Tetsu's spine and into his veins, his fugue state shattering. Having a major weakness of his quirk, one that he took almost subconscious pains to hide, discovered and aired in such a short amount of time, Midoriya really was a genius. And far more dangerous than people gave him credit for. Ha! Tetsu chuffed, wobbling as he got to his feet. The steely teen retook his defensive stance, tensing to keep his limbs from shaking. "So what? I'm still going to take you down." With that, Tetsu threw himself forward once more. This time, however, even the untrained in the audience could tell the steely teen was being much more careful as he engaged. Both of his arms were now up, and his forearms shielded his face against the vertinet whenever he took a swing with the rocks in his hands. Likewise, he was quick to backstep whenever the flow of combat made it Midoriya's turn to attack. The trading of blows continued, minutes ticking by. Tetsu could tell he was slowing down, his strikes lashing out less and less, but refused to stop. Midoriya, on the other hand, appeared to be having no problems dodging everything he threw at him. Then, crack. A solid blow to Tetsu's temple landed. The steely teen's vision blurred, he stumbled and only just managed to stay on his feet. Izuku shook his head at that. He had little trouble in his current state locating and exploiting openings in the steely teen's defense, but damn it if the guy just wouldn't go down. Even hitting him where it hurts didn't drop him. It was honestly impressive. Around the two students, the audience cheered. Surprisingly, there were now just as many people rooting for the monster of UA as there were those attempting to rile up the flagging 1B student to take it down. Midnight found herself conflicted, on one hand glad to see some idiots could learn, while on the other disheartened that the aggression against a student of hers was still persisting. Surely such vitriol and hate would dampen anyone's fighting spirit? Except, Midoriya didn't seem like he was paying the stadium's audience any mind at all, the cheers or the jeers. The R-rated heroine couldn't help but wonder where such resilience had come from, what struggles the Vertinet had already suffered through to find such things as more of an annoyance than anything else. Looking at her other student, it was clear to the Ravenet that Tetsu was trying really hard to keep in the game. He'd stood back up from every blow Midoriya had landed, but just couldn't find an opening to land a single punch of his own. Honestly, it was like the Vertinet could predict his moves all of a sudden. Crack. Another chunk of concrete had managed to slam into Tetsu's temple. The steely teen almost vomited, not even caring that he lurched back this time away from his red-eyed opponent. He looked up from where his hands had shot up to cover his aching head, but couldn't focus. The world was swimming. Keeping his enhancement up was proving difficult for Izuku, but at the very least, it made it reading Tetsu a piece of cake. Besides his deduction regarding one of the major weaknesses of the steely teen's quirk, Full Rush had also allowed him to see the 1B student heavily telegraphed his moves. It was like he wanted to announce to the world what he was going to do next. Boom crack. Izuku took advantage of Tetsu continuing to reel from his last blow, and struck out at his other temple this time. The steely teen collapsed to his knees. "I guess this is it," Izuku muttered, taking in his beaten-down opponent. Tetsu looked like he felt inside, that is to say, hurting all over. His stomach hadn't stopped trying to eat itself since he'd activated Full Rush, and he just knew he'd feel like he was starving for days after this. But at least victory was his. Weathered and worn as he was, Tetsu was once again faced with another of his weaknesses. Legacy, determination, strategy. All of his previous opponents had played to their own strengths. Now, all the steely teen could think about was that he'd defeated them because he'd been underestimated as being just a brute. Izuku reared back one last chunk of concrete, ready to land the decisive blow that would end the match. Balefully, Tetsu thought back to his 2 victories. Ida had lost due to gear malfunction, not because he'd been superior in technique or strength to the speedster. Ashido had lost because of bad luck, her crippling injury taking her down long before he'd ever had a chance to outmaneuver her nimble fighting style. Yeah, for all he'd thought he'd learned his lesson, he was still a brute, wasn't he? Midoriya taking him apart with intelligence and adaptability just proved it. Izuku rose up like a baseball player coiling up for a pitch, planning to put extra momentum into the strike that would be the final strike. But, despite his shortcomings, in his heart of hearts, Tetsu still wanted to win. Greya. With a mighty roar, the metal manly man of 1B lunged forward, faster than he'd moved yet during the match, catching his opponent by surprise with the last-ditch tackle. Instead of going for a direct beatdown, Tetsu controlled himself and chose the smart option, playing it safe. Tetsu knew that Midoriya was too smart to fall for any normal strategy. With that in mind, he pushed hard, grappling the vertinet against his shoulder as he aimed for the edge of the arena. Tetsu grit his teeth as he struggling against his captive's resistance. Midoriya was lithe, not built for fighting in a contest of raw strength, even boosted, and this way he also avoided the risk of getting the vertinet's blood on him. It was his best chance to win, no matter how much it galled him that he'd have to settle for a ring out instead of a knockout. But he knew he had to start fighting smarter, and this was one of his first steps. Izuku flailed, only having seconds to comprehend the sudden situation he found himself in. Tetsu had managed to recover a hell of a lot faster than he'd predicted, not to mention then moved so quickly that his increased perception hadn't been able to give him the advantage he'd already grown used to. Now it was obvious the steely teen was planning on throwing him out of bounds. Honestly, overcoming such a debilitating state as he had made the vertinet's respect for his opponent increase dramatically. It was clear that the other hero in training was putting his all into the match, even going plus ultra in his own way. A twinge of self-recrimination shot through Izuku at that thought. He'd been in the wrong believing that Tetsu would be defeated by simple strikes to the head coupled with his unexpected increase in strength. In that, he'd underestimated his opponent, just like every person who'd ever dismissed him out of turn without truly knowing him. It made the vertinet feel a fair bit of guilt inside. Even so, I don't want to lose. Izuku internally screamed as some sixth sense felt the edge of the arena get closer and closer. Between one furious blinking of sudden bloody tears and the next, the world disappeared for Izuku, and a memory filled his vision. He was watching an ancient recorded wrestling match, some American show from the pre-Quirk era. The wrestler he was cheering for was rather small in comparison to his opponent, if still muscular in his own right. The other wrestler, however, could have easily been described as a mountain of muscle, easily an intimidating sight in a world before quirks. Izuku suddenly realized this memory wasn't his. He remembered the day his little family had watched this show, and he'd been in the kitchen helping his mother while the zombie girls had been watching the television. Saki had been cheering loudly as he saw her doing now, Lily had been in the corner cuddling a newly bought plushie, just as she was at present, and Tae. Before Izuku could consider the implications of being unable to see his oldest partner, the match on the television continued. The might of the mountainous wrestler proved insufficient to handle the agility and acrobatic prowess of his smaller foe. It was impressive to watch, almost difficult to believe as the shorter, quirkless man blatantly seemed to defy gravity with his showy moves. Then it happened. The smaller man was put into a grapple much like he had just been. In the blink of an eye, the wrestler had executed a flashy move, completely reversing the situation. Another blink and Izuku had returned to the present. And Tetsu had delivered them to the edge of the arena. Hi-ya-ya. With a mighty bellow, the steely teen put his everything into tossing his opponent, only to find that the wily vertinet had one final trick up his sleeve. Izuku grabbed the metal arm closest to his hands, shifting his weight with a jerk to redirect his momentum. Lacking any training at all in what he was attempting to do, the vertinet opted instead to consciously force his legs into position, trapping Tetsu's neck between them. Letting go of the arm he'd grabbed, Izuku crunched, swinging his upper body from one side to the other, transitioning all of the momentum he'd kept up into throwing himself back into the arena. Tetsu, however, found himself completely off balance, the redirected kinetic force from Midoriya's sudden move carrying his body forward despite his efforts to dig his heels in. Before he could stop himself, concrete turned to air, which quickly turned to grass. The steely teen was out of bounds. And oh-ympsh! Tetsu's cry was cut off as he landed heavily, his steel body creating divots in the ground. And Izuku Midoriya wins by ring out. Midnight shouted, no less amazed than any other person watching the match. The Ravenet could hardly believe how down to the wire the whole thing had become. A disjointed cheer rose up from the stands, more than the young necromancer had received previously, but still far less than any other of the sports festival's competitors. There'd been many who'd expected the hardy transformer to be able to put an end to the dark mutant menace, even in the face of evidence to the contrary. Now that the monster of UA had won again, it seemed that there was going to be no way to stop him. But among those who did cheer, that was a head scissor. Saki shouted out as loudly as she could, startling everyone around her with her sudden exuberance. The boss is such a badass. Even more than I'd thought. Way to go, boss man. The blonde's outburst, while surprising to many, was also informative. Izuku's classmates now understood that the Verdunet's finishing move hadn't been a random, if lucky, action of desperation. Instead, he'd used what must have been a well-studied technique for him to pull it off in the heat of the moment. Truly, the Emerald Necromancer's breadth of knowledge was terrifying to consider. While Class 1A chattered over another revealed skill of their classmate, around the world many watchers weren't as lucky as to have the technique explained, and didn't recognize it from any other kind of acrobatics. However, there were a handful of countries in certain parts of the world where pride in over a millennia of tradition had just reawakened in the face of Izuku's match. Mexicans, American descendants of wrestlers from the pre-Quirk era and their fans, and a few other scattered groups had just been reminded of their heritage. Nana. Tay grunted as she stood from her seat. Next to the undead Ravenet, Tsuyu didn't understand the grunt herself, but could clearly recognize that the oldest of her boyfriend's partners was worried. Lily agrees. Lily chirped, standing as well. With Momo having sequestered herself in her prep room already, the littlest zombie had no problems getting up. You got a point. Saki agreed, suddenly somber as she stood up as well. The boss is going to need us. Like right now. Without a word, Tsuyu joined the undead trio as they left 1A seating area and made their way into the tunnel system leading down to the arena. The frog girl noticed the usually calm zombie girl's haste, but decided against questioning them. Izukuin had fought with great ferocity after all, and used some new ability on top of that. It was obvious he'd need nutrients right away. And congratulations were in order anyway. Redacted, bar. Tamura Shigaraki. Kurojairi, dressed in his fashionable bartender fare as was the norm, rumbled to his charge, "What is the term used for a character that can heal but also participate in fighting?" There was clear unease in the bartender as he spoke, though his question was entirely valid at this point. Until now, the misty villain had assumed his charge's target was merely some sort of regenerator, a dark, undead-controlling, gun-slinging regenerator to be sure, but a nominally normal one all the same. And when dealing with such individuals, Kurojairi had expected him to have the one weakness that was almost universal to that quirk set, general frailty. That expectation had just been worrisomely disproven. Paladin. He's a goddamn paladin. Shigaraki, for once far too happy, was nearly vibrating on his stool. That was not a good thing. We found a dark paladin who's taken an oath of death. Kurojairi did his best to ignore the implications of his charge's words, instead doing his best to focus on the remainder of the sports festival. The bartender did his best to squash the misgivings that were nevertheless worming their way into his mind the more he watched the Verdunet on the screen. The boy hadn't been this strong during their failure at the USJ, had he? And what did his unexpected strength now mean for the future? Would he keep getting stronger? For some reason, the thought made Kurojairi shiver. Aichi Prefecture, the Azui household. Only minutes ago, the two verdant-haired mothers, Inko Midoriya and Baru Azui, had been holding hands in absolute motherly bliss. Their children had just, if rather unorthodoxly, promised themselves to the other on live television, broadcast internationally the world over. It went without saying that the wedding wouldn't be held for much later, young as their babies were, but the promise was there. The two older women, though only one looked her age, had no doubts that their children would one day happily sign the papers when the time came to officially begin their future as a happily married couple. Baru, of course, had been incredibly relieved when her elder daughter had forfeited. She loved Tsuyu and of course wanted to support the girl's dreams, but the idea of her standing against the son of Endeavor? That right there had easily climbed to one of her top 3 nightmares. The frogwoman's heart had nearly stopped when she'd noticed the dual-haired scion had taken a step toward her daughter even after she'd moved to leave the arena. If Midnight hadn't stepped in when she had, the matriarch knew she would have gladly brought all of her considerable legal powers to bear and utterly destroyed UA, and all of its staff for their continued negligence. But luckily it hadn't come to that, this time. Still, there was something wrong with the Todoroki heir. She could feel it in her bones. Aniki is incredible. The dark turn of Baru's thoughts were derailed as the synchronized shouts of her tadpoles tore through the room. Seeing her two youngest so happy and energetic was heartwarmingly wholesome for the frog woman, something she'd be eternally grateful to the Emerald Necromancer for. Truly, Samidare and Satsuki loved how heroic Izuku was, how cool he looked while facing off against seemingly unbeatable opponents, and had quickly become the boys' biggest fans if you didn't count her eldest. Even so, Baru was also aware of the reality of the situation. All the power Izuku had shown today would doubtlessly attract more attention than ever before. And that was definitely not necessarily a good thing. "Ganma dear," Baru called out, seeing her husband returning from the kitchen bearing snacks. "Do you think you could call up some of your old friends and have our future son-in-law assigned a few discreet protections?" The man in question looked at his wife, saw the haunted eyes and heard her faux calm voice that denoted when Baru was hiding how afraid she was of today's ramifications, and did what he did best. Making his way over to the disturbed frog woman, Ganma wrapped her up in his thick-set arms, pulling her in with ease. Seeing the normally overwhelmingly powerful woman so concerned was a sight the father and husband didn't see often, so rare in fact it had been years since the last time. "Already did," Ganma confessed softly, tilting his head so that his wife's would fit into its customary spot between his collar and his chin. The position never failed to bring a sort of peace to the strong woman he'd married. Even managed a discreet guardian with some actual authority. Baru sighed in relief, finally allowing herself to release the last bit of tension she'd held onto when her husband had gathered her up into his arms. Once again the practical man had proven, as he always did, that he was beyond reliable and supportive to his family and loved ones. It was one of the many reasons she'd always made sure to keep him within arm's reach when things got tough. Not that she didn't trust him, but because she trusted him with her life. Meanwhile, Inko huffed while her hosts had their moment. Thanks to spending so much time around the Azui matriarch, the rejuvenated Midoriya had become aware of many potential dangers she'd never even dreamed her baby would ever be facing. She'd, of course, understood quirkism, having gotten an education on top of raising a child with a so-called lesser quirk. However, to have the extreme some people would go to for it spelled out so plainly, it was all too terrifying to consider. It hurt to know that her poor Izuku would soon have to deal with such unpleasantness in an entirely different sense than he had so far in life. "I know that discretion is important in matters like this, but I think I should call up the girls at the beach as well," Inko threw out, surprising her amphibian hosts. "They may be rowdy and wild, and I'm not sure I approve of them seeing as Izuku as some kind of overlord, or whatever, but as a group they really know how to keep troublesome people out of your hair." Baru turned from Ganma's arms, wanting to argue against the suggestion. She really did. But there was little to no fault in the logic of her fellow mother's plan. Doremi, the biker club that had taken over Dagoba, had become the talk of Mizutofu more and more recently. A former street gang turned club that spent its time cleaning and maintaining a beach instead of harassing the community? When the rumors had first begun, no one had believed such a tale, the good news only marginally becoming accredited when it appeared in a well-known local newspaper. Whatever goodwill the club had gained for its efforts, however, was always almost instantly destroyed whenever an interested party visited the beach in person to check it out. Doremi hadn't lost any of their viciousness since taking up residence at Dagoba. Indeed, considering the beach their turf had made many of the girls almost authoritarian in managing it. Sure, they kept the area pristine and picturesque, but in turn it had become a tourist trap. There were now entry fees, heavy littering fees, only expensive food for sale, prepared on-site, with rules against bringing in your own, and even the lockers in the locker rooms needed keys that had to be rented from the main kiosk to be opened. On top of that, the girls were still bikers, and while they freely raced around on the track they'd installed on the beach, no one else was allowed to so much as step foot near it. That didn't even consider the other rumors. There were tales recounting bloody beatdowns at the slightest sign of unruliness or unwillingness to pay the needed fees. Whether or not they actually happened or happened as often as decried, was a matter for her future son-in-law to straighten out. And then, of course, there were the whispers, hateful threads of gossip that swore that since Midoriya was the true owner of the beach he had to be controlling the gang with his abhorrent quirk, forcing them into enslavement, in every sense of the word. No, using Doremi as bodyguards would be a risky option. Unfortunately, it would also always be better than the worst alternatives. Just imagining a psychopath such as Endeavor approaching her future son-in-law out on the street whenever he felt like it sickened and terrified the frog woman. UA's Sports Festival Stadium, Tunnel 9. Izuku heaved, nothing but acridity spilling from his lips as he kneeled, not by choice but as a result of his body failing in the most critical of ways. As soon as the match had officially ended and he'd been dismissed, he'd somehow managed to get himself into the tunnel out of the arena before noticing anything was terribly wrong. But now, the Verdinet would have panicked if he'd had the energy, but as it was, he could only slump further. Everything hurt, his bones, his muscles, even his skin and hair. Even his clothes against his body felt like rough-hewn weights carved out of lit coals and Arctic frost. Worse, he couldn't feel his hands, or his face. Parts of him were failing, shutting down hard with no fuel to run on. The enhanced muscle fibers from the match were long gone, devoured in seconds for the dual purpose of repairing any damage Tetsu had managed to cause any of Izuku's vital organs as well as to refuel the starving black hole that was cursed blood. Any chub around his abdomen or ass, that had been swallowed as well, leaving him appearing sunken in instead of athletic or lithe. Worse, even his bones felt frail now. Knowing that cursed blood wouldn't allow him to die from all of this suffering was precious little comfort to Izuku in the moment. He'd survive, sure, but there'd be no more festival for him if he didn't turn this around fast. Summoning all of the erstwhile determination he'd exhibited from the previous ordeal he'd just faced, Izuku pushed his will into raising an arm, moving a leg, anything. He just needed to get to a vending machine. Faintly, Izuku felt the weight of his will boil down through his shot nerves and flagging muscle. His hands twitched, but that was it. Izuku Midoriya had finally reached his limit. As he laid there limp as a rag on the floor of one of UA's tunnels, the Verdinet almost chuckled at the absurdity of it all. At least now he knew for sure the true extent of his capabilities. He would never be superhuman, it seemed. It was clear that his body wasn't able to tolerate the insane amount of strain such power produced without serious repercussions. Cursed blood may have been powerful and versatile in its own right, a jack of all trades of a sort, but as such, it was a master of none in the end. If he wanted raw, overwhelming strength, then he'd have to be content to only using the enhancement in short bursts instead of as a sustained ability. At least he could say he was learning. Izukuan. Boss. Oni-chan. Garurg. Just like that, for angels descended upon Izuku after rounding the nearest corner of the tunnel he'd collapsed in. In the arms of these divine beings were the treasures of heaven itself, and never in his life had the Verdinet ever been happier to see piles of junk food headed toward him before. UA's Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena. Without a shadow of a doubt, a panting and bruised Momo Yaoyorozu knew that she wasn't going to win her latest match. Present Mike might have announced Todoroki's warning about limiting the excessive use of his powers, and reminded the heterochromatic about it to boot, and Aizawa-sensei might have opened with words of caution that were no doubt directed at her. But even so, the heiress knew she'd gone as far as she could. She had nothing more to show. She'd foolishly phoned home before the match, in the hopes of finding some sort of moral support from her family, only for her supplications to have been met with stern words of reprimand and demands to stop this madness. She'd been ordered to avoid the Todoroki heir entirely, to forfeit as soon as she could to protect herself from her own weakness. Such reception had broken the Ravenet's heart, having gotten used to the easy kindness and warm friendships she'd made since attending UA. The disappointment from the phone call had only added to her stress at that point, increasing the weight she'd felt on her shoulders to make some sort of showing against a true powerhouse such as her dual-colored classmate. But with the fatigue she'd already been accumulating from the previous events already compounding the drain she felt from a lack of Lily hugs, Momo had realized just how disheartening her situation really was. The ravenous hunger hadn't and still wasn't helping either. The embattled heiress steeled herself, consciously compartmentalizing her problems for later so she could focus on the match for as long as possible. She needed to move, do something before Todoroki just ended things. Taking a quick moment to think had the Ravenet suddenly pushed forward, deciding to take a page from Jiro's book. At the very least, no one was ever going to say this Yaoyorozu went down without a fight. Aha. Momo's cry came suddenly and full of pain and surprise. From one moment to the next the heiress had gone from completely fine to having her entire right arm encased in ice. This shouldn't have come as a surprise but somehow still did to many. Although that might have been caused by how the match had played out up to this point. Todoroki hadn't started with his ice as he had previously. Nor did he use his fire as had become the norm already. Instead, the heterochromatic had jumped straight into a brutal martial arts assault. Momo would have agreed at the time as she batted aside blow after blow, that her opponent was disciplined for sure, well-trained and held a sure strength to him. Against one such as her though, it still shouldn't have been enough. The Son of Endeavor's ability, such as it was, should have been far too inferior to her own mixed style of martial arts and weapon mastery to be a cause for concern to the heiress. The problem had quickly become apparent to Momo, however. Todoroki wasn't exhausted. And she was. For much of the sports festival, Todoroki had been able to save his strength for one reason or another, allowing him all the stamina he'd ever need to outpace an opponent now in the third event. Even so, Momo had managed to keep the two halfway evenly matched until this last lull in combat, where they'd separated and eyed each other for further weaknesses instead of immediately resuming fighting for once. That's when Momo had decided to use her quirk. She'd planned on hiding her creation use behind a whirling martial arts technique, hoping it'd distract Todoroki enough to strike him down. Instead, the son of Endeavor had used the split moment she'd had her guard down to transition into the movements to cripple her. Well, there you have it, folks. It looks like Todoroki has given our beloved heiress the cold shoulder, along with a whole arm. Am I right? Present mixed commentary, offbeat humor as it was, did nothing to lessen Momo's stress. She could barely feel her right side above her waist now. Her fingers were the opposite, however, so cold they felt like they were burning. To make matters worse, she'd lost concentration on the item she'd planned to create when she'd been attacked, and had ended up wasting the material involved. Now she didn't even have the energy to make an attempt to break the ice that had captured her. Worried eyes flicked up and just caught the sight of Todoroki moving. The heterochromatic had taken a step forward with his left foot, and his right was just about to step forward again. Utter fear of being frozen solid shot through Momo, anticipatorily chilling her blood, and the heiress quickly kneeled down as if in more pain than she was. It was truly a disheartening strategy development, but the Ravenet was now panicked, and when one's back was against the wall there was sometimes no room for honor. There's no shame in accepting one's limits when they're found. No matter how hard we train our bodies, they will always fail us if we push too hard without rest. Perhaps if both students were experiencing an equal amount of fatigue, the match would have played out differently. The combination of seeing Yaoyorozu curl into herself at the sight of him and Aizawa-sensei's follow-up to Present Mike's comment incensed the Todoroki scion. It was as if no one recognized how strong he was, how skilled. They looked at him as if every choice he'd made so far today was a mistake. What did the cheering of the ignorant public in the stadium mean to him if those in authority still refused to acknowledge him? He knew he was superior not because of the bastard's curse, but because he could do all of this, get so far, with his mother's gift alone. And hadn't he just shown he could use his mother's gift to pacify an opponent without going overboard? He'd already met the principal's requirement, after only a single match. Competitor Yaoyorozu, Midnight's wary yet inquisitive tone brought the heterochromatic back to the present. Can you continue? Momo uncurled, leaning back as she sat on her shins and knees. Her earlier panic was entirely gone, leaving only the blank mask of the Yaoyorozu family behind. The heiress raised her frozen arm, looking at the numb appendage analytically. After a moment of silence, she shook her head no. Todoroki wins the match by forfeit. The stadium exploded in cheers and applause. Todoroki heard none of it. The noise from those in the stands wasn't the praise he felt he needed, what he wanted. They cheered for the son of Endeavor, not for him, never him. Worse still, every time he blinked, for some reason his mind conjured up the disappointed stare of the principal. There was no other way then. As Todoroki walked away after melting the ice on Yaoyorozu's arm, he steeled himself. He was going to face the monster of Yue. He was going to show the world that he could beat anyone with his mother's gift. It would be the darkest quirk against the purest blessing. As the Todoroki scion entered the shadows of the tunnel to his waiting room, one last thought crossed his mind. Midori is the type of foe that will require extreme use of force to even stand a chance against. Does that mean the principal's warning will be null and void? Omake cutie? For Hades? When Junko Kanno had woken up to life again, the Sylvette hadn't expected to so quickly find people who would be so willing to see her as anything other than a monster. Her roommate, the vulgar oaf, notwithstanding the young former idol, had been certain that her life would be filled with nothing but hate, fear, rejection, and scorn. But now, yes, yes, and hell to the yes. The Bakugo matriarch sing-sang as she kept wrapping measuring tape around the Arachnitor's large body. Oh. Stay still a sec, sweetie, I need to get this one size just right. Meeting the oaf's family had been a weird adjustment. During their second meeting, Mitsuki Bakugo still hadn't shown a lick of fear at the Sylvette's mutated body, not even the familiar twitches people gave when attempting to suppress such. Hell, the ashen blonde mother hadn't even shown signs of trying to ignore her extra-human features either. She just saw them, accepted them, and moved on. Well, Kanno struggled to find the words. failing on whether or not show gratitude or dismissal would end her embarrassment faster. There's no need to go so far for me, really? Mitsuki huffed, hands folding on her hips as she gave a glare to the spider girl her idiot son had gotten himself involved with. Nonsense. The ashen blonde shot back after a minute of evil eye, now sporting a wolfish grin. A cutie such as yourself deserves to have the most comfortable and fitting of cuts making her clothes as possible. It almost made Kano's head spin even now, that the Bakugo family treated her like such a part of the family so quickly after having been formally introduced. Actually, scratch that, they were treating her better than her own family. Even the oaf's father, Masaru Bakugo, who'd been the only one to offer any sort of opposition to her moving into his home, had shown her the kindness of a father she'd always wished she'd been lucky enough to experience. And to be fair, the exceedingly calm man's real problem had only been a desire to keep a cutie, such as her, from having to suffer his bombastic son's attitude for too long too soon. That well-meaning motion had been shot down, however, as soon as it had been clarified for the bespectacled man that the two were already sleeping together, in the same room, as roommates. "Are you sure your husband will be all right?" Kano asked suddenly, though not for the first time. Masaru wasn't the problem now, of course, she was just extremely self-conscious. I mean, I look like this, you know? Won't he lose his job if he's seen with me?" The ashen blonde merely shook her head, a weak smile on the woman's still youthful face. "Don't worry about that, sweetie, you're actually the reason he's getting a raise soon," Mitsuki assured as she continued to check each of Kano's 8 legs individually and with skill. "Now relax a bit, will ya? I need to see how far and wide your legs spread when not tensed under any stress." Kano grimaced but looked away so the woman measuring under her couldn't see. The Sylvette knew that the Ashen Mother meant well and that the Bakugos as a family were working for her benefit. Even so, knowing that the two adults valued her silk so highly made her feel almost completely divorced from her dreams of becoming an idol. Not that she'd ever become a proper idol now, but it was still a sad reminder as to how things could have been. "You're gonna look so adorable in one of my husband's dresses." Mitsuki began to gush in absolute delight. "And you'll make a perfect centerfold for one of the magazines too. Although the lack of shoes might." "Wait!" Kano shouted, interrupting as soon as she halfway processed what the ashen blonde had been saying. The Sylvette desperately attempted to grasp onto how the situation had escalated beyond all normality and comprehension so quickly. "What dress? What magazine?" Mitsuki blinked up at the startled arachnator that now looked shocked into a stupor of some sort. Had no one told her? Surely she'd strong-armed that idiot brat of hers to let his roommate know what the plan was, right? "The fashion magazine my husband designs for?" The ashen blonde answers, somewhat questioningly, as if still expecting the spider girl to suddenly remember. Seeing no recognition in the icy blue eyes staring widely back at her, the woman sighed. "They've been looking for something original to work with for ages now, and you'd honestly be perfect for the job." Kano couldn't believe this. What was her life right now? Was this even real life? "You might not be able to be a conventional idol anymore with those bigots up top calling the shots over there," Mitsuki continued, sneering to the side at the mere thought of the fuckers who'd ruined more than one good young woman's life for truly asinine reasons. "But if you start over as a model and then maybe even go on to become a pro-heroine, then I think it'll be the idols who'll end up being the ones envying you. Now really, I can't wait to see you in this dress." Ignoring how the Ashen Mother had almost painfully changed subjects, Kano sharply began waving her arms back and forth in denial, shaking her head for good measure. "Me? Model?" The arachnator sputtered, trying and failing to imagine herself strutting out on a catwalk she could barely fit onto anymore. "What made you two think that would be a good idea?" Indeed, whatever mental image Kano could conjure up was utterly nightmarish to say the least. Spiders weren't cute, beautiful, or anything close. Her fears of Masaru being summarily fired as soon as he introduced her to the magazine's photographer suddenly felt a whole lot more valid. "Because you're a cutie?" Junko Kano was beginning to realize that all of the Bakugo family were insane. But as Mitsuki buzzed around her merrily and she began to hear the telltale cursing of the oaf coming back down the hallway from where their handler Bo had taken him for their scheduled appointment, the Sylvette could be forgiven if the smallest and most precious of smiles stole across her face. Just for a moment. "Omake, woes of a father, for Vincent D'Andrea." Masaru Bakugo sighed again as he slumped at his desk. Today's sigh was the first in a long while that was of relief, however, instead of utter despair. "I can't believe it's almost been 6 months already," the tired man murmured, looking at the blocky date staring back from his monitor. "Am I even ready to have him back home yet?" The shaggy brunette could still remember the day his world had come apart at the seams, when he'd come home and heard about what had happened at UA. He should have known the instant he'd seen Mitsuki and Katsuki both sitting there at the table, downtrodden and silent, that something was horribly wrong. Even so, the pure shock had almost killed him. His son, his loudmouth brat, who he'd changed the diapers of when he'd been little, who he'd taken to the park on his off days years back and snuck Boken habanero to and taught to cook, and his son, his hot-headed boy, who'd refused to listen to his life lessons on kindness and moderation, who'd scoffed at his stories of goodwill and penance and railed against warnings of pride and wrath. Katsuki had gone too far. His Katsuki had attempted to murder the adorable little Midodriya boy, the one who'd always wanted nothing more than to help everyone he could, because he couldn't be a man and take a defeat with dignity. And to make the matter all the worse, 2 other completely innocent souls had been caught in the crossfire. Maybe I should have been at home more? Masaru mumbled, dragging a hand over his face while looking at the family picture sitting pride of place on his desk. No one really looked happy in it. Why did he even have it there then? Did I become one of those deadbeats who gets too absorbed in their work to be a good father? Fuck, have I even been a good husband lately? Speaking of, he also remembered how when he'd first listened to Mitsuki recount what had happened, something hadn't added up to him. His woman, the one who'd hunted him down and taken him as a prize for herself, was an Amazonian champion. Nothing could get her to back down, for better or worse, and that personality probably could have intimidated a pro-hero into submission if anyone had ever asked him. But there she'd been, meek as a mouse and just as quiet. It had disturbed him almost as much as what Katsuki had done, if for entirely different reasons. Where had he been when his wife had changed, lost her fire? Had it been sudden? Before he'd had time to worry more about Mitsuki's out-of-character behavior, she'd managed to spit out the names of their son's other victims. I must have royally fucked something up for him to have ever done something so idiotic and just plain psychotic. The second son of the Ida family and the firstborn of the Azui. When both names had been dragged out into the open, Masaru had known his family had been thoroughly fucked. Not one, but 2 separate titans of society had been poked in their most sensitive of areas by his son at the same time. To say the families in question could have utterly destroyed his own near instantly was a true understatement. Keeping things under wraps had been his first priority the day after the first official notice had reached him, but unfortunately news of his boy's crimes had reached his bosses faster than dawn itself. Hours of meetings had boiled down to a handful of options, all in part thanks to years of hard work and having gained a reputation for being a decent human being. But they'd all been bad one way or another. His more conservative seniors had advised him to divorce Mitsuki and disown his wayward brat first. As if that would have solved anything, merely left him bitter and alone. Then there'd been the advice from the more moderate persons to settle the whole affair out of court. A wise choice perhaps, but Masaru had known right off the bat that he couldn't afford to play ball against the likes of the Ida and Azui. Then there'd been the last alternative from old man Nagai. Do nothing, lose everything, and kill himself to regain some familial honor before the wrath of the families baying for his blood came for him. Thank the gods for little Izuku and his bottomless heart full of kindness, Masaru said as his eyes trailed over a newspaper clipping he'd kept. The scrap proclaimed the Verdunet's name minutely under the more blaring headline concerning the assault on the final judge. I really need to send him a present at some point, and soon. Before we move out to our new home. The tired man blinked away the tears that threatened to fall. It hadn't been exactly the biggest of surprises to the shaggy brunette to hear that his family's salvation had originated with Izuku, and not some so-called mercy from the Azui or Ida. The gods knew what kind of mercy those 2 families were accustomed to doling out, and it was to the last always better described as quick and painless death than forgiveness and a second chance. So yes, he'd gladly accept that he owed the young Verdunet his life. And now he could get that life back on track, so it was worth something again. Learning that Katsuki had, after all his brat had done and the break he'd suffered, somehow still managed to land a cute girlfriend while sealed away at Siriidii Institute of all places had come as quite the shock, but a welcome one. It would have been remiss to ignore that the young woman was a mutant though, however that had never really bothered Masaru even in his younger days. That mindset had helped him greatly in life actually, and Kano's perfect mix of inhuman and model-ready looks had instantly given her the ability to cover all the prerequisites required to become a great model for the new project. Indeed, when Masaru had shown the Sylvette's picture to an editor he'd known had been assigned to the new project, she'd agreed to give him a chance, if he could promise to bring Kano with him. He'd focus on fashion for extreme mutants, part of a new magazine aimed at selling more toward those who'd never be able to hide their mutations and had been oppressed for too long. The promotion had included an older, traditional-style home, which turned out for the better as well. His soon-to-be daughter-in-law, no matter what Katsuki said, looked like she'd feel more at home with a proper amount of space to move around in. Now, they just had to get to Osaka without anything else going wrong. Chapter 33. A Sinister Showdown. "All right, gentlemen," Midnight called out, idly noticing that only Midoriya had deigned to give her his attention. "Remember the rules. True heroes uphold and follow society's rules and laws. Do not aim to kill. You're training to become heroes here. Begin." This was it, the end of the road. Despite all the naysaying and blatant favoritism, Izuku had made it to the final round of the first year's sports festival. If he were honest with himself, he hadn't really expected to get this far, only make a good showing to piss off the bigoted assholes who'd been pulling strings behind the scenes. Showing the world at large a portion of his quirk hadn't hurt too much either. At least now the dark mysticism surrounding him might start to dissipate now that everyone had had a chance to see his scary mutant quirk. Even present Mick's final introductions had failed to register with the Verdunette earlier, so in his own head had he been. The raucous adulation for Todoroki when he'd walked out? The utter silence for himself and Lily? Aizawa-sensei's deadpan assurance that the littlest zombie was actually his deadliest asset and that the front row should leave their seats? None of it had registered to Izuku, because now he faced arguably the strongest member of Class 1A Shudo Todoroki. Taking a single calming breath, in a split second Izuku took in the teen standing across from him, and once again began to analyze. Todoroki was in pain, true deep emotional pain, that much was obvious. The heterochromatic had been far more detached throughout the day than normal. In fact, he'd seemed to deteriorate the farther the festival had gone on. A bad situation had just kept getting worse, and now it might be too late to turn it back. Izuku felt like punching himself. If he'd been less emotional himself when Todoroki had revealed his past, instead of selfishly comparing it to his own, he might have been able to think clearly enough to have done something, said something better than what he had. Unfortunately, due to his own actions, now whatever divide that had been separating Todoroki from him and everyone else had grown into an ocean. Reaching out to his heart would be nearly impossible now. Before Izuku could continue his analysis and self-recrimination, Todoroki moved. Had he been facing any other opponent, Shudo knew he would have taken the time to open with a speech of some sort, reaffirmed his personal oath, maybe even explained why he couldn't afford to lose. Once having reached the final round, he'd always planned to reveal why claiming victory with his mother's gift alone was all that mattered to him. But now he faced off against an opponent that had proven far too dangerous for such indulgences. Any chance to think, to adapt, to use the tools at its disposal would give his one last obstacle too much to work with. And that wasn't even taking into account the diminutive undead that also stood in his way. The pale brunette's quirk was almost a bigger hazard than his opponent. The dual-haired teen could still feel the phantom aches it had caused as a result of Aizawa-sensei's disruptor acclimation drills. "This ends now," Todoroki shouted as he stomped his right foot onto the ground. "I'm not giving you a chance to get in my way." Multiple spikes of ice shot up from the ground at wild angles around the heterochromatic, the longest and sharpest of which were all trained at his opponent. Against any other foe, such a move would have doubtlessly caused a moment of panic. A handful of icy spears suddenly being aimed at you would freeze any sane person in place. However, there'd be no winning in a single overpowered opening move for the dual-colored teen this time. Screery! The sudden scream lasted for less than a full second, but the effects of the undead's shriek were instantaneous. To Todoroki, the world abruptly went out of focus. His opponent's figure blurred beyond recognition, and all sound became muffled as if his ears were stuffed full of densely packed cotton. He felt extremely nauseous, and only sharpening his breathing to quick pants kept the heterochromatic teen from losing the contents of his stomach. Worse, his spikes of sharpened ice didn't just slump as his control slipped, most of them shattered. Without his mother's quirk to sustain them, the constructs were left fragile, easy prey for the vibrations of the screech that could somehow hit just the right frequency. The son of Endeavor wasn't the only individual affected, however. Off to the side, Midnight had been forced to lock her knees stiff just to keep the sudden weakness in them from causing her to pitch over. The nausea had hit her like a truck, worse than anything she'd ever experienced even back when she'd been prepared for it this time. She wouldn't let a little queasiness take her out, damn it. Sitting up in his observer's chair, however, Cementos had to deal with his first real exposure to dissonant song, in stoic silence. The blocky literature teacher clenched his teeth, fighting to keep the queasy feeling rocking his normally solid stomach down. The pro hero had never been more appreciative for a set of earplugs in his life. As soon as the festival was over, he'd be happily slipping Eraserhead a bottle or two of melatonin for passing along the abilities of Midoriya's zombies earlier in the year. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena, Front Row Seating? What the hell was that? Endeavor managed to growl out while gripping the railing in front of him for dear life. The moment he'd heard that horrible noise, the number 2 hero's fires had snuffed out, his knees buckled under his not-so-insignificant weight, and his vision had doubled on top of blurring. Then, as he'd struggled to stand up, wave after wave of nausea had hit him relentlessly. Just how in the hell was his masterpiece even still standing after bearing the brunt of such an insidious attack? Completely beneath the Flame Hero's notice, a certain duo had collapsed, their world spinning out of control and their ears ringing louder than a pair of steam engines. Beside them, a certain Catboy sighed in exasperation as he looked over the two, even as he steadied his own wobbly self against the wall. By all the quirks that were good and holy, did he hate disruptors. UA Sports Festival Stadium, commentator press box. Now ain't that a sugar-coated nuke? Even from their position high above the stadium's crowd, both present Mike and Eraserhead could easily hear the groans caused by the former's latest pun. Of course, most of those with front row seats were in pain for an entirely different reason. Almost every single person, man or woman, young or old, had their hands clapped to the sides of their head in pain. Only now were they seeming to realize that they should have taken the underground hero at his word and left their seats earlier, like the pros who'd been sitting with them had. The longtime friends watched as the youngest Todoroki wavered for a moment. If he tipped over now, the match might as well have been over. The dual-haired teen spread his stance, doing everything he could to center himself. Wow. Only for Izuku to leap forward and land a solid punch right to his scarred face, rocketing him back to roll along the ground. I don't need you to give me a chance, the two pro heroes heard Izuku say through the video feed from the nearest drone. The Vertinet slowly stepped forward. Like most of our classmates, I'd rather give it my all and make my own. Hisashi could only stare as Todoroki struggled to stand. He'd known the little undead listener packed a punch, but this was insane. He glanced at Aizawa, but the gruff man seemed to be entirely focused on the battle down below. Unwilling to miss even a single moment of the match himself, the blonde turned his attention back to the arena. Lily Hashikawa's quirk is not only a nullifier, it's also one of the most destructive disruptors on record to date. It's so powerful that it damages her vocal cords to use, although that drawback is almost completely mitigated now due to her current situation. Hisashi snapped his gaze back to his friend. Blinking, he saw that Aizawa's finger was pressing the red air button, meaning his words had just been broadcast to the entire stadium and every listener tuning in all over the world. The voice hero turned back to the action again, silently wondering why his old buddy thought sharing such information was logical. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena. Todoroki struggled for a second more, his entire body inside and out aching. Experience had made it all the easier to swallow the bile when it had tried to come up after the hit. It would take more than a punch and a second of exposure to dissonant song to take him out for good. Managing to get his feet under him, the dual-colored teen finally stood up, firm and ready to continue. The crowd, those not incapacitated anyway, went wild. If you think that's enough to stop me? Todoroki growled, unable to keep his bubbling anger locked away for a moment. You're dead wrong. He readied a fist of his own, charging forward. Wow. Quick as a flash, Izuku had stepped into Todoroki's charge instead of backing away and hammered another not-so-light punch into his face. Then he pulled back his other fist. Wow. Todoroki, having been momentarily stunned by the power and precision of the first strike, now returned to the ground once more, ragdolling half a meter back. To his credit, the dual-haired teen had the presence of mind to roll into a kneeling position afterward, lifting his arms into a defensive position. Around the two combatants, murmurs were breaking out amongst the public. Many had expected the monster of UA to fight with the ferocity due his epithet, but they'd also expected the Todoroki scion to be able to fight back and take control of the match fairly easily. An instant win might have been out of the question, but the near beatdown they were witnessing was pulling at the already frayed edges of their collective mindset. Just how was one as blessed as Shudo Todoroki struggling against a mere mutant? Ever so slightly, true seeds of doubt began to take root. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Class 1A seating box. I knew Midoriya wasn't going to be holding back, but... Kaminari trailed off, unsure how to put his chaotic thoughts into proper words. The sparky blonde wasn't quite sure how to feel about someone like his class's vice president taking someone like Todoroki apart so easily. Should he be worried? Upset? Depressed he'd never get to that level? He didn't know. But at least he could be thankful that his class's seats weren't anywhere near the front row. I mean, this is getting ridiculous, don't you think? Zero finished his blonde classmate's thought, a nervous smile doing nothing to hide the teen's thoughts. Facing off against Midoriya had already been bad news before due to his zombies, but this was something else. Seeing the extent of the Verdunet's actual capabilities was quite the eye-opener for the plain-faced hero in training. Fuck off. Saki's unexpected curse startled the idiotic duo, the two flinching back in their seats. The only ridiculous things here are you two. You really expect to become heroes while being such insecure pussies. The called-out teens, for once in their lives, wisely decided against attempting to fire back at the undead delinquent. The Siriidii Institution Mess Hall. Junko Kano stared wide-eyed at one of the 3 overly large screens the institute had installed so that the patients could watch the UA Sports Festival, her jaw clenched shut to keep it from falling open. This was the true power of the monster the vulgar oaf had dubbed Romero, wasn't it? She could see it now, like a veil being lifted from in front of her eyes. An ability that allowed him to somehow keep up. No, overcome a prodigy like Endeavor's son, it was just unnatural. How could a mere mutant quirk be that overpowered? While the Sylvette dealt with her inner thoughts, Katsuki Bakugo could only stare furiously at the screens, teeth nearly cracking under the pressure of his tight-lipped snarl. He'd known, hadn't he? He'd always known there was something off about that green-haired freak. The blonde could admit now, but only to himself, that he'd let his emotions to get the better of him back at UA. He'd known the wolf in sheep's clothing would pull something, but he'd still allowed himself to be swept away in the moment. Now he couldn't do anything as what amounted to a villain in the making was about to win the first year's festival and gain support and acclaim from those that didn't know any better. It was infuriating. He needed to get out. He needed to get out and do it right the next time. He'd get his license, he and Legs both. Then the two of them would wait. They'd train and train and train. It'd burn at his soul, but he'd make sure his partner would keep him on the level, keep him from making another foolish mistake. Then they'd be there ready and waiting. Waiting for the moment when the monster on the screen would show its true villainous face to the world. And then they'd take it down. Art. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena. Why? The question, spoken loud enough for the down Todoroki scion to hear clearly, was heavy with deep emotion. Why can't you? Don't you lecture me? Todoroki's sudden shout cut off the approaching Verdunet with its sheer ferocity. More emotion than had ever crossed the heterochromatic teen's face in the last 10 years now boiled to the surface all at once. I told you about the nightmare that is my life and you brushed it aside like it was nothing. You said I was a second coming of Endeavor. I am nothing like that monster. My life is a curse because of him. The word stuck Izuku hard. The desperation, the rage, the pain, the fear. He could feel all of it radiating from the dual-haired teen in a roiling miasma. It was so much worse than he'd feared. Now more than ever the Verdunet wished he'd been able to say something different to Todoroki when they'd had their confrontation earlier in the day. Maybe if he'd been supportive even just a little bit, then his classmate wouldn't look as if he'd just gone feral. Maybe all that had been needed was a little understanding. The Todoroki scion leapt to his feet and stomped hard with his right foot before the young necromancer could complete his thought, more spikes of ice lancing up from the ground toward him. Screery. Only for the constructs to collapse as their creator was forced to kneel once more. You're right, Todoroki-san, I shouldn't have acted like your pain didn't matter, Izuku admitted as he walked up to a now shaking and visibly troubled teen. That was wrong of me, I should have listened. But now you need to listen to me. The Verdunet reared back a fist once more, ready to put as much force into the next strike as he could without using his quirk to reinforce his body. Your life is cursed? Well, so is mine. Izuku shouted, rebellious tears threatening to blur his vision before he fought them down. But I'm doing everything I can to rise above it, to be a hero. I've made friends. I've faced down my tormentor. I've even begun to accept my quirk, all of it. But what are you doing, huh? Because all I can see is you hurting yourself and others to prove a point. Is that what being a hero means to you? The readied fist launched forward, but Todoroki had already reacted. In an instant, the down teen had moved to evade the strike, running his right hand down the arm outstretched before him. After leaving a growing frost on the offending limb, he completed his retaliation by rolling back to regain some distance between himself and his opponent. The maneuver had cost him, however. Agony ripped through every muscle in the heterochromatic's body, the searing feeling clearing away the red fog that had been clouding his mind. As he fought through the pain, unbeknownst to Todoroki, he could think clearly for the first time that day. But that only led to what hurt the most, realizing that his Oppo, that Midoriya, hadn't been entirely wrong. What had he been doing? Accusing the so-called monster of UA that he didn't understand what suffering meant? Screaming that his life was cursed? Hurting his classmates with his mother's precious gift? Focusing only on winning, damn the consequences? Justifying his every action as worth it if it meant succeeding without the bastard's influence? Glowing baby, he really was becoming the bastard, wasn't he? Between two heartbeats, Shudo felt his stomach flip again, this time in no way due to dissonant song. He stumbled back, hands snapping up to encase his suddenly throbbing head. This wasn't right. He was supposed to be everything the bastard wasn't. He was going to use his mother's gift and leave the bastard as a forgotten footnote in history, a failure only tangentially attached to his success. He was supposed to rise above his curse, be better in every way than the trash that had forced his creation. But he needed to do all of that, right? He needed to be better, always had been expected to be better. What was the point of all of his suffering if he had nothing to show for it in the end? He had to make it mean something. But, what had he really been doing? He'd accused an undead child of being ignorant of suffering. He'd tried to knock classmates from the air to win a race. He'd focused so much on revenge against Midoriya he'd ignored his teammates and saw their contrary actions as mutiny. He'd nearly killed a girl with his mother's gift. Shudo felt sick. But, as the dual-haired teen's thoughts began to circle dangerously close to existential crisis, Izuku again approached him, completely unaware of the inner turmoil. The young necromancer wasn't quite sure why his classmate was now holding his head while shaking, but it didn't look good. Another step forward was a step too far. Head snapping up, a wild-eyed Todoroki glared at Izuku with absolute hate and absolute sorrow. "I'm not like you, Midoriya, our curses are too different," Shudo gurgled out, standing shakily. The world narrowed as eyes of gray and teal met opposing emerald. "Yours was a fluke of birth, mine was forced upon me. Yours caused you to suffer, mine caused others suffering as well. Yours can be turned to helping others, but mine can only harm and destroy. You fought to keep your hope, and I..." Shudo clenched every muscle he could still control to keep from screaming as he pushed himself forward, willfully ignoring the signals from his body that begged him to rest. One step. Another. Two more. Slowly, momentum building, the dual-haired teen built enough steam to run forward. "I will win to regain mine." Izuku blinked, not having expected such a particular declaration from his classmate. A trickle of something that suspiciously felt like hope began to pool in the Verdunet's stomach. His views were still terrible messed up, but maybe Todoroki wasn't too far gone? "I know your moves now. I'm going to beat you," Shudo declared, launching a fist toward Midoriya's freckled face, fully intending to lay the Verdunet out. Whamcrack. Gagaha. Only for his fist to collide with Midoriya's ice-encased own. Every festival viewer who'd ever stubbed their own toes, slammed a door on their hand, or for the pro heroes, been on the wrong end of a missed punch or kick, winced at the sight. Prodigy or not, the Todoroki scion's hand was doubtlessly broken, and that was no joke. As he stumbled by his Verdunet opponent, such thoughts were seemingly proven correct as Todoroki cradled a now limp hand to his chest. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Class 1B seating box. "I knew that wouldn't work." Kinoko cheered, nearly vibrating with delight. It had disturbed many of her classmates at first how fervently their shortest member had been supporting 1A's vice president throughout the entire tournament, but she'd looked so happy no one had yet tried to stop her. And if Minoma had ended up knocked unconscious a few more times than normal, well, no one was saying anything about that either. One could deduce that frigidity mayhaps engenders no authority upon the deceased? Yanagi lowly offered, among the members of 1B attempting to explain what they'd just witnessed. A frozen limb had to cause some pain surely, and be incredibly hard to move encased in ice besides? So how had Midoriya moved his frozen fist quickly enough to counter Todoroki's attack? In her own seat, Itsuka's wince was more empathetic than most. As the ginger nursed her own hand, now encased in a plaster cast, she remembered her own experience with unexpectedly punching something too hard, too quickly. If she'd known it was coming, she might have been able to prepare for Yaoyorozu's tonfa, but the Todoroki scion? Yeah, he was going to be feeling that for a long while. Aichi Prefecture, the Azui household. Arms wrapped around each other, Inko Midoriya and Buru Azui gave separate, silent prayers as the final match dragged on. Both mothers were beyond worried, but both for very different reasons. Inko could only wish for her baby's survival. The rejuvenated mother still remembered how that one friend of her son had nearly died facing off against the number 2 hero's child. Her baby boy could survive a lot, she knew that, but he'd never been frozen solid before and she didn't want to chance it now. Baru meanwhile was torn. On one hand, she could only imagine the sort of life anyone under Endeavor's thumb had to have suffered up to this point. It was a fate she wouldn't wish on any child. On the other, her eldest had been forced to forfeit a chance to move forward in the tournament because of her justifiable fear of the youngest Todoroki's instability. Not to mention the Jiro child had nearly died. Was it any wonder the frog woman was split between worrying for her future son-in-law's health, and how much pain little Lily would have to push through to scream the Todoroki scion into oblivion? UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena. Izuku took a step back, taking the chance to command a little extra blood to his frozen arms so he could break off what remained of the ice while still keeping an eye on the ragged form of Todoroki. The two competitors were now on opposite sides of the arena from where they'd started. Midnight needed no further incentive to take such a chance to intervene. Competitor Todoroki, are you able to continue? The voluptuous heroine's question caused a tense, expectant silence to fill the stadium. The public, civilian and pro alike, was split between their preferred outcomes. Many wished for the young heroine training to endure, to show the might of his pedigree. Others, mostly those who knew from experience what it felt like to work through utter exhaustion and pain, hoped the teen would accept his limit and keep himself from any lasting damage. If you cannot answer, I'll be forced. I can continue. The proclamation was surprising, not insofar as the son of Endeavor had declared he'd keep fighting, that had almost been a foregone conclusion even for those hoping against it. No, it was the fact that the heterochromatic teen had a look upon his face that gave almost every viewer with a weak constitution the shivers. There was something off about his eyes. And it wasn't that they were different colors or that one was surrounded by scar tissue. But Lily knows that's no mere ouchie. Lily said, popping up beside Midnight to intervene. Opponent or not, meanie or not, good or bad, it didn't matter to the brunette. She didn't want to see anyone suffer. Mr. Candy Cane really should. Well. Continue, Todoroki spat out, frost growing to cover his injured hand to both deaden the pain and provide a makeshift cast for the limb. Well. Win. Shaking her head, the R-rated heroine could only do her job and announce her wayward student's decision. Competitor Todoroki has chosen to continue. Midnight declared, the stadium erupting in cheers immediately after. For the Ravenette, however, she wished so much that she could have just called the match over with. The voluptuous heroine wasn't blind, nor was she inexperienced. Todoroki was beginning to slip. There was a line between pushing beyond one's limits, going plus ultra, and running oneself into the ground out of sheer stubbornness or obsession. She couldn't be the only one that thought that, right? And that wasn't even getting into Todoroki's restrictions. Midoriya might have been one of the few students who were equipped to deal with the dual-haired teen's full power, but that really only made things worse for everyone, didn't it? Even now, Midnight could tell that the Verdunette was beginning to reach some sort of limit himself. And she really didn't want to see what happened when these two completely snapped at each other. And how are you going to win, Todoroki-san? Izuku asked, calling all of the world's attention to himself. He refused to balk under such scrutiny. If he was going to take a chance to help his classmate, he wouldn't waste another opportunity. You've handicapped yourself from the beginning, and where has that gotten you? For a moment, Todoroki looked positively feral. But then he blinked, and the wildness was gone as the teen seemed to visibly swallow his emotions back down. Here, Midoriya. I've gotten all the way here, Todoroki said flatly, staring blankly at his opponent. The mask had returned, but the cracks were too big to ignore now. The perfect veneer of emotionlessness was nearly gone, but the heterochromatic teen clung to it desperately to keep himself together. And I'll go even further. I'll win the festival with my mother's gift, and once and for all bury my father's curse. Without it, I'll never become like. That's bullshit and you know it. The shout interrupting the dual-colored teen was sharp and uncompromising. Izuku had reached his limit. You're not cursed, Todoroki-san. At least not in the way you think, Izuku continued, pinning his classmate with a blazing glare. He could see his words weren't getting through, confusing clouding the gray and teal gazing back at him. Fine then, time for plus ultra. You're not cursed because you don't have your father's quirk. You don't even have your mother's. For good measure, Izuku snapped forward and helped his point along by clocking Todoroki in the face for a fourth time. Wow. As Shudo sailed back to get reacquainted with the ground, all he could think of was that Midoriya had gone back to a boxer's moveset for some reason. But lying on the ground was no escape for the Todoroki scion from the Emerald Necromancer's latest reality check. Endeavor's quirk produces a flammable chemical he can control with pyrokinesis once ignited. I can infer your mother's is similar, although akin to liquid nitrogen as an initial agent instead, Izuku said, now standing over Todoroki to the point he could see the wary confusion in the heterochromatic's eyes as he waited for him to get to his point. But yours does neither. Shudo couldn't breathe. The words made no sense. What? The dual-haired teen weakly questioned. The response only seemed to infuriate the Verdunette standing over him. You don't just generate ice or fire, Todoroki-san, you can change the temperature of things you touch, Izuku explained, shaking his head in disappointment that this had never seemed to occur to his opponent. Did he really hate himself that much that he stunted his own knowledge of his quirk? That ice grew on my hand earlier, it didn't stop where you touched me or after you let go. To do that, you must have had to slow down the particulate vibrations in the air around my hand to the point the water molecules nearby had no choice but to bond together. And from that I can guess that your left side works the same way, just in reverse, increasing particulate vibration until friction causes ignition. Shudo was speechless, bewildered to the extreme. Was Midoriya telling the truth? Could it be a lie to distract him? His ice had always been a gift from his mother. He'd always seen it that way since the day his quirk had first activated. But then what did that mean about his other side? Had he been wrong this whole time? What was he without his gift and curse? Todoroki-san, a better name for your quirk would be molecular vibration. Izuku kept talking, halfway surprised his classmate hadn't lost it and started attacking him again. But if Todoroki was feeling like listening for once, who was he to deny him? If you truly controlled fire and ice, wouldn't you be more immune to frostbite or burning? Following Midoriya's now pointing finger, Shudo realized his opponent was indicating his ice-covered broken hand. The limb was beginning to turn blue. From the looks of it and personal experience, the dual-haired teen knew that he likely had minutes to defrost himself before necrosis began to set in. He hadn't noticed the state of his hand. He'd been so fatigued, so in pain, that the cold had just sort of faded into the background. Now that it had been brought to his attention, however, Shudo realized he really was on the edge of a dangerous level of hypothermia. All the same, his goal hadn't changed. Midoriya's opinion of his quirk didn't matter in the moment. He'd still push himself even harder, go beyond. Nothing could stop him. He couldn't afford to stop now. So what? Shudo asked, aching as he forced himself to stand. None of that changes what I must do. And I'll do it without becoming like that bastard. Then stop acting like him. Shudo flinched back, struck by a blow much worse than any physical attack. His chaotic thoughts returned again to the previous events of the day, ordering his teammates around solely to fulfill his needs, yelling at an undead child, freezing his classmates solid in a glacier. But he'd only been using his mother's gift. He couldn't be at all like that bastard's if he didn't use his left side. Right? Shut up. The scream of despair was quickly followed by the thud of a shoe stomping hard into the ground. Spears of sharpened ice immediately sprang into existence, all aimed at the green-haired cause of so much inner turmoil. Shashayak. Skriri. Only for most of the constructs to once again fail to fully form thanks to the effects of dissonant song. Shudo managed to keep his footing this time, however, he couldn't keep himself from dry heaving for a moment. When are you going to realize being like Endeavor has never been linked to using your left side? The simple question rocked Shudo almost like a psionic earthquake. He blinked. What was Midoriya spouting now? Not linked to his left side? Not linked to fire? The heterochromatic's rage, which had been simmering under the storm of his indecision and despair, burned anew at this latest mockery of his suffering. Before he could spit out a response, however, his opponent had already continued speaking. You and I both know there have been, and currently still are, many well-loved heroes the world over that use fire-based quirks. Hell, my own father had one too, and he was just a regular businessman, Izuku revealed, shocking his battered classmate back into silence. But none of those heroes, not one, were ever as feared or despised as Endeavor. And do you know why? The pause after the question sat there, heavy with tension, confusion, and expectancy. Off to the side, Midnight had picked herself back up from the latest effects of Lily's use of dissonant song, and had caught the tail end of her students' discussion. The heroine frowned, realizing for the first time there really were quite a few similarities between the two teens in front of her. Although, that just made the differences in how they had turned out, so to say, all the more glaring. Seeing that Todoroki either wasn't willing or able to think of a response, Izuku sighed and decided to keep going. He felt like he was making progress. Maybe? It at least seemed like the dual-haired teen was second-guessing his actions now, instead of being completely convinced his actions were in the right. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Principal's Viewing Box. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is how a real hero acts, Nizu stated, proud once again of his choice of successor. If he could have even one student like Midoriya in every new batch of hero hopefuls that walked the halls of his school, then the quirked animal knew the future of the world could be so much brighter. Even when he makes mistakes, even when he's forced to fight an opponent of incredible talent and skill, he still tries to save everyone he can however he can. Turning slightly in his overstuffed chair, the principal of UA gave a side-eyed glance at the assembled members of the board. That is the hero in training your bias and greed nearly smothered, Nizu continued, the growl at the edge of his tone setting the men and women in the room further on edge than they were already. To a man, the gathered humans could already see the terrible plans for them forming in the quirked animal's eyes. You'd better hope that young man continues to be the hero he is when I'm done with you all. He just might be the only thing that will save you. With those ominous words, Nizu turned back to watch the events unfolding behind him. It appeared he'd need to get further involved in the Todoroki matter than he'd originally imagined. From what he could see and hear, thanks to UA's drones, more had been revealed in this match than anyone could have expected. Frankly, it worried him. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena. Todoroki-san. What is it that you love most about your mother when you think of her? Izuku asked suddenly, visibly throwing his heterochromatic classmate with the apparent subject change. In fact, Shudo almost choked, his emotions going haywire. His mother had given to him his greatest gift, but she'd also laid upon him a lifelong mark of his curse. A potent combination of all-consuming guilt and sadness mixed with a deeply held sense of content, joy, safety, and even love at the thought of the woman who'd given birth to him. He remembered so little of her, but it still mattered so much. And most of all, besides the night she'd marked his curse, was the constant sense of, how was this even a question? Her kindness, Shudo whispered, eyes glazed as he saw something no one else present could. Deep inside, the dual-colored teen felt something shift, a part of him long since locked away for his own well-being being released, and memories he hadn't even remembered shoving away came flooding back to him. His mother, consoling him after the latest beating, disguised as training from his father. His mother, playing with his hair with gentle touches until he fell asleep to her reading bedtime stories of heroes of old. His mother, laughing as he helped her make a giant batch of soba while noodles covered him all over. His mother, letting him lay on her as the two watched All Might on the television, basking in the number one's true heroism. Don't worry, Shudo. Stay true to yourself and use your power to be who you want to be. More and more memories, all the little moments filled with kindness, with love, flowed through Shudo's frozen heart, melting the ice he'd long ago encased it in. Long-forgotten dreams, childish thoughts of being a true hero like All Might himself, thawed in the warmth of his cherished memories of his mother. But they didn't seem so childish now. Nor did they seem so out of reach as they once had, sunk in the shadow of his father. Wake up, Todoroki-san. Don't you see? The sudden shout snapped Shudo back to reality, a reality where Midoriya was again in front of him, again about to punch him in the face. The suddenness wiped away all thought from his mind, leaving only an instinctual fear of being hurt again. That instinct took over, and the heterochromatic acted without thinking. Ah! Seshu. Gigantic pillars of ice erupted from the ground, cutting off Izuku from reaching his target. The pillar's sudden appearance caused the Vertinet to trip over his own feet as he tried to keep from slamming into the massive constructs. Screery. Another blast of dissonant song caused the ice pillars to collapse, but this time it was Izuku who was sent stumbling back, doing his best to avoid the large falling pieces of ice and frost. The top of the constructs came down and smashed into the ground with force. Boom, 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 boom. And the resulting shockwave sent Izuku, already unsteady on his feet, flying back. At this point, Midnight had had enough. The two teens had been keeping the match to a mildly brutal, but still acceptable level of quirked violence. In fact, besides dissonant song, the Ravenet couldn't even tell if Izuku had even been using his quirk. But something had spooked Todoroki, and he'd once again used his quirk on an unbelievable scale. And with Lily having caused the construct to immediately collapse again, this was probably her only chance of stopping things from getting completely out of hand. All right, stop. Midnight called out, turning her mic up to full volume. The R-rated heroine's voice reverberated throughout the stadium, even shaking the glass in the VIP boxes up top. Izuku slid back, only just keeping his balance in the end. The Vertinet threw her a questioning look, a mix of why and what now. Even the littlest zombie turned her way, wondering what was wrong. But Shudo Todoroki didn't stop. A wave of flowing ice flowed into existence in an instant. The sheet of frost crashed into Izuku and shot him back toward the edge of the arena. Right toward one of the original ice spears that Todoroki had tried and failed to create earlier in the match. While a majority of the constructs had collapsed thanks to dissonant song, a fair few here and there had somehow managed to keep their solidity and their sharpness. There was a great gasp, as if none watching could believe what they were seeing, and then silence. Shudo, coming to his senses, could only stare in voiceless horror at what he'd done. Midnight, so close to the action, had a hand over her mouth to keep herself from making a sound at the sight. If she did, she didn't know what it would be. The stadium and all seated within were stunned and shaken. Around the globe, men and women paled, looked away, or covered their children's eyes. The monster of UA had been impaled through the chest by a spear of ice. Blood leaked from the grievous wound, a trickle joining it from his mouth as well. The world was frozen. Because Izuku Midoriya was still alive, and still looking at his opponent with clear eyes. As is Shudo Todoroki. "I'll ask 1L last time," the monster intoned, the ears of every single sports festival viewer bending to hear the lowly spoken words forcefully spoken through a shattered chest. "Do you see?" And with that, glowing red eyes fluttered once and then shut. Shudo made to answer, to scream, to do something he didn't know what, but he couldn't. He couldn't move. Izuku-kun. Boss. The match was over, the first year's tournament had ended. But what had been lost along the way? I'll make grave regrets for White Tiger 789. With UA Sports Festival in full swing, it was no surprise that every television still functioning was tuned in to watch the sensational event. Every family, large or small, in their own homes or out in public, took time out of their schedules to watch Japan's most famous hero school. In a seemingly normal middle-class apartment, however, a certain family watched on with conflicting emotions. "But is this shit for real?" A young man just entering his 20s exclaimed with some aggravation. Was that really her? The her in question was a ghost from the family's past, a stain on their familial honor and name. Not an hour ago, during the first match of the third round's tournament, the young man and his parents had been shocked to see said ghost appear on screen. It can't be," stuttered an older woman clearly past her prime. The woman denied what she saw with such staunch vehemence it was almost believable. She didn't have enhanced strength. She didn't even have a quirk. The woman was taller than average, but that was all she had to offset an otherwise unremarkable appearance. She'd married into her husband's family at her father's suggestion, so that he could gain a number of benefits for her birth family's transportation business. The desire for their quirks to mix into a stronger variant in any potential children hadn't needed to be said at the time. Unfortunately, while the business had flourished, the woman's children hadn't been quite as successful an endeavor. 2 mediocre quirks and 1 useless quirkless. It was all she could do to bear the shame until the failure had been allowed to run away. Why now? The woman's husband, an older man, growled as he stared at the screen intently. Why now, damn it? If there was one thing worse than having a quirkless child, it was having a quirkless daughter. Marrying such a wretch into a respectable family would always be an impossibility from the start. Not to mention the drain, both financial and social, of supporting such a useless person could drag your family's name into the muck forever. The man had also found, after a number of rather unscrupulous inquiries, that even selling such trash's body as payment for favors was a rather feeble option. Apparently not even the regulars of the brothels wanted to dirty themselves with such waste. Who knew? And so, their family's shame had been allowed to remain in their household, a silent, despised leech, until it had gotten the message and finally left them of its own free will. Even then, the failure's friends, and hadn't that been a nauseating pill to swallow, had spent weeks and weeks bothering them afterward. Had they called the police yet? Had they checked with so-and-so? No, they had not. No, they did not. They spent that time instead focusing on the 2 of their children that would actually amount to something. Thank you. The reporters had been even worse. That it had taken months for the bothersome idiots to give up and accept the failure was gone without a trace was an irritation that still bothered the man though. And now, 2 years after he'd finally been able to put the failure out of his mind as safely dead, she turned up. On an international broadcast that couldn't possibly been faked, the little shit had popped up as some undead abomination capable of maiming a respectable human being with startling ease. Holy shit. The young man, who was in fact the son of the two elder occupants of the home, shouted as he pointed at the screen. The older woman huffed in response of the replay of a girl who looked like some gutter trash artsy type being swallowed up in a glacier. Now that's a lot of damage. The sight of seeing a powerful quirk in action was a welcome distraction for the older man, bringing a small respite of peace to the house. Of course, with big names such as the Todoroki Scion included in UA's incoming class this year, the stain on his pride and honor would surely not catch too much attention. Sure, the failure had reappeared after years of being missing. But she was obviously being used as a puppet by some dark mutant freak as well. No one would fault him for wanting to distance himself from such a thing. Crack-a-boom. The older man's delusion was shattered at the exact same time as the glacier on the television screen was. It was unbelievable. It was impossible. It was infuriating. The largest disappointment in the man's life had again shown power on the scale of a high-caliber pro-hero. It was like a screaming declaration to the entire world that he'd fucked up, that he'd thrown away the best chance his family had had at becoming something. That is. The woman paused, still gaping at the screen. A drone had flown in for a close-up of the figure that had demolished the Todoroki Scion's glacier. It was undeniable. My daughter? The man and woman, after trying unsuccessfully for a nearly unacceptably long stretch of time, had ultimately had 3 children. First had come a daughter, a decent mix between the two in features at least. Then they'd been blessed with a son, and they'd rejoiced that their family name was secured for the future. And then had come the quirkless, who they'd originally thought would be their perfect creation until after 5 birthdays no power had shown itself. Their firstborn, the ungrateful slut, had run off to marry some nobody in Okinawa the very same day the two had blatantly refused to officially register their youngest as missing. She never called, never wrote, never even returned their own calls. The last the two had heard, the ungrateful bitch and the punk who'd stolen her away had opened a successful food stand. Apparently, fishing lure wasn't such a pathetic quirk if one went into the food business on an island nation. That right there is beyond just enhanced strength, mother. The woman's son shouted, wildly gesturing to the screen filled with the image of a pale, growling girl. That's actual fucking super strength. The couple's son, who'd only inherited the husband's unimpressive lantern eyes, had honestly not turned out any better in the long run. While his quirk was, at the very least, an emitter type, it was basic at best. Projecting light from your eyeballs at less than 100 lumens was a far cry from the two's hope of him developing some type of laser vision. Ultimately, however, it had been the boy's attitude that had doomed him. He'd become a shut-in after failing to pass the college exam he'd been aiming for, never leaving his room if he could help it. As if the whore he'd been hoping to follow there from his high school would have had the brains to give him the time of day he deserved anyway. Privately, the older man acknowledged that his family was a failure. But he'd found solace in the fact that at least it wasn't a public failure. But now, with what had been broadcast live just now, he was going to be a laughingstock for the rest of his life. All because he'd somehow missed that his seemingly quirkless child was actually the only one with potential. It wasn't his fault, damn it. How was he supposed to have known the brat would develop such power? A father? The man scowled but turned to his sorry excuse for an air. Don't you think we deserve some sort of compensation? The man blinked. His wife blinked. The two stared at their son uncomprehending. You know, that freak's got to be using her body every day, right? The young man continued, greed now shining in his shallow eyes. It's only right that we demand some sort of rent for her services, right? A moment passed. The man pondered on the thought before deciding it wasn't that bad of a thought at all. According to what he'd heard earlier when the failure had first appeared on a breaking news report, it really was dead, only being animated by the quirk of that damnable green-haired mutant boy. He could demand the body back, but even then he'd known it would have only meant expending money to bury a worthless corpse. But now, I think you're right, my boy, the man finally replied, a madman's grin slowly growing upon his face. The idea had taken root and bloomed into quite the cash crop. It seems that your sister will finally be of some use to us, now that she's dead. The woman pulled out her phone and began to scroll through her contacts at the implied permission from her husband. I'll contact my dear brother. He'd be more than happy to help us with that necessary legal maneuvering, she said, joining the conversation when she found the number she'd been searching for. Looking up, the woman stared intently at the figure of her long-lost daughter on the television screen. It's honestly beyond time we pay a visit to our dear Tae-chan. I'll make a serious joke, for all about nothing. Sitting in the stands of UA's famous stadium, one Emi Fukukado sighed. Not too long ago she'd finally managed to corner, read ambush, the only man she'd ever wanted to make smile forever, and not only had she failed to do so after so long, but worse, she'd accidentally made him remember. I'm such a dumbass, Emmy thought while curling herself into a ball in her seat. She tried valiantly to keep her infamous smile in place, but it was in vain and the mask dropped pathetically. Why did I have to go there? The seafoam greenette sighed again, and was once again grateful for the fact that her kids were so grossly overly attentive to the matches. None of them even questioned her about where she'd been or why she hadn't been smiling when she'd returned to their side. Instead, she'd been bombarded with tales of a zombie, yes really, a zombie nearly killing a first-year student. She'd found the notion hard to believe, even when her coworker had confirmed the tall tale. What I need to do is find a way to make up for this, Emmy finally decided, continuing to largely ignore the fights occurring below. Those horrible scars, mine might be physical but his almost seem worse, for all that they're invisible. It had been a long time since the pro-heroine had womaned up and stopped running from the fact that everything that had happened on that damnable dark day had all been her fault. It had been her idea to hide her pregnancy from her lover. She'd wanted to surprise him one morning with a baby bump, whenever it would have shown up. It had been her idea to take one last mission together, score one last victory before revealing her secret and being forced to take the inevitable bakery break. All pregnant, enlisted pro-heroes had to. It had been her idea to follow the villainous pair after they first ran off, even when Shoyuta had suggested they regroup and wait for reinforcements. And then, when she'd woken up after the battle, she couldn't even face him, her partner in more than just hero work, the man who, even if he'd complained the whole way, had been there for her before. She'd shut down after being told the horrible news, that she'd lost their baby. It had just been too much all at once. She'd been too much of a coward to face reality, accept her punishment for her stupidity and hubris and confront Shoyuta. She'd even been such a coward as to let him carry the blame for it all when the internal investigation had started up. By the time she'd pulled herself together and realized what a hole her life had in it without him, tried to contact him and pick their relationship back up, it had been too late. She'd found out he'd carried out a bloody crusade of destruction against the villains who'd gotten away. Worse, a mutual friend of theirs had then told her Shoyuta had been contacted by a pair of jiggers, and then just disappeared. I refuse to lose him again, Emmy thought, sniffing hard as each thought became more painful than the last. Each memory opened old wounds to bleed afresh. I don't think I'll be able to go on if that happens again. She'd cried for months after that, then cried harder when no amount of pleading, bartering, or threats had gotten her any details on the pro-hero Eraserhead's whereabouts. Only after a year of silence, of torture, had she gotten word of Shuta's return to Japan. She'd meant to find him, beg for forgiveness, run into his arms and kiss the stupid man until he'd passed out from oxygen loss. Instead, she'd stalked him from the airport to a new apartment, and that had caused all the hurt to come rushing back, and then just cowered away. Again. She'd stumbled through life after that, half coherent to the world around her. Her work had suffered, she'd drifted from her friends, and more than once she'd almost died on the job due to negligence. It was fair to say she'd probably been fairly suicidal at the time. Then she'd gotten the offer from Ketsubutsu. It had been like a fresh rain rejuvenating her soul. All the kiddos who needed guidance, all the faces that would light up when she cracked a joke, all the hope and possibilities for the future. After who knows how long, she'd finally worked up the courage to face her man again. Or well, the man who had been her man. She actually wasn't sure they'd officially broken up, even after all this time, but in reality it didn't matter. They hadn't spoken for so long they might as well have. Talking to him was supposed to have put an end to haunting nightmares, it was supposed to be a fresh start. What had she done with that opportunity? She'd had the greatest flop since forgetting her morning after pill and tried to use her quirk on the man she'd wronged so completely. Sheshayek. The sudden appearance of a glacier in the middle of the stadium, and a big one at that, broke the seafoam greenette from her mental prison of regrets and wasted chances. For once she had to focus on the here and now. Following the frantic pointing and screaming of her students, Emmy realized that one of the competitors had been completely encased in the massive ice construct. Instantly, the pro-heroine in her knew that the situation was dire, and that the student trapped was in immediate need of rescue. But instead of succumbing to panic like her students, "That's the second worst case of cold shoulder I've ever seen," Ms. Joke joked. It was completely a self-defense mechanism, her ability to joke in the face of any situation. Before, she'd had to spend hours and hours watching comedy routines from all over the world to be any good at improvisational humor. Now, she still wasn't any good at it, but the ability to even crack a joke without thinking allowed her mind a chance to remain calm and focused even in the worst-case scenarios. Of course, doing so without activating her quirk almost always led to being stared at instead of laughter, like right now. "What?" Emmy asked, her look of innocence fooling absolutely no one. Crack-a-boom. All groans and deadpan stares were interrupted by the unbelievable sight and sound of the glacier being split in two by a single attack. There in the arena was the infamous undead Ravenet, the girl Eraserhead had mentioned through the unofficial channels utilized by the underground network. He demanded that everyone, no matter what, never underestimated the strength of that girl. "Understatement of the fucking century, you shaggy furball," Ms. Joke murmured as she took in the scene below. The trapped student was saved, and the undead and some cute kid quickly aided the one with a bird head in carrying the former to safety. As the pro-heroine and teacher continued to ponder on the new development of what she just witnessed, her students shivered where they sat. All of them were treated to one of the rarest sights of their young lives. A serious joke. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed supporting the writer. Don't forget to like, sub, share, and donate for more videos.